Douglas boys, thank you very much, Douglas, for coming to give us this talk. It's fantastic. First came across Douglas when he wrote me an email with an article for 2017 edition of the Butterfly Conservation, North Wales Butterfly Conservation newsletter, in which he kind of described his study of moths in birds' nests, which is just here. Fantastic. In fact, it was really good of him to kind of send that to kind of put in the, and it was really an interesting article. It even stimulated me to do the same sort of thing. I think I've got 2 or 3 different species out of birds' nests that lived in birds' nests. I think Douglas got far more than that. He filled his shed with birds' nests, I think. But then he did another article for us, which is fantastic again. Next time I saw him, he did an article in the 2019 version. Common names can be marvellous, but do all species need them? A wonderful article about all the various names, common names that moths might have or whatever. Okay. And he also gave a talk at our AGM, Butterfly Conservation, that year. He's a busy guy, now doing his PhD, which he might elaborate on during his talk. But I thank him so much for coming along today, and it'll be an interesting, stimulating talk. Quite a few of us are kind of first year moth trappers, I know that. Some a bit more experienced maybe, and some know very little at all. So we're quite a mixed group. So I'm sure we'll all get something from it. So I'm now going to hand over to Douglas. Hopefully he's going to appear on my screen very soon. Hello. There he is. So Douglas, there you go. Thank you very much indeed. I'll leave you to it now. Okay.
I'll just share my screen and get my slides up. Right, there we go. Hopefully everyone can see those. Thanks for that introduction, Mark. So yeah, my name's Douglas. I've been interested in moths now for since I was 12, I think, so about 11 years now. And I've always found moths a particularly fascinating group. I've studied them in various forms throughout my education. I'm currently now doing a PhD at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology down in Oxfordshire, where I'm looking at the effects of light pollution on moths. But today I'm just going to give you a sort of a general overview of moths, of British moths, and also how you might go about catching moths in your garden. Because moths really, I feel, are often seen as a sort of the lesser cousins of butterflies, and they don't enjoy particularly good PR. And I think that's unfair. And I think there's many misconceptions around moths. So hopefully, for anyone who sort of has any of those misconceptions, hopefully I'll go some way to dispelling them today. So we want to start off by talking about, just start at the beginning really, what exactly is a moth? And then I'll tell you about their life cycle and some interesting facts about their biology. I'll move through to talk about British moths, how they're doing, how they're faring, how many species we have, things like that. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about how you might go about finding moths in your garden. I think Mark said some of you are new to mothing or thinking of getting into mothing, so hopefully that might be useful. Right, let's go then. So what exactly is a moth? Good place to start. So moths and indeed butterflies both belong to the order Lepidoptera. And this is a Greek word or a combination of 2 Greek words, which basically means scaly winged. So this is the feature that really sets both butterflies and moths apart from any other groups of insects, because they have these scales that tile their wings, just like roof tiles on a house. And these are 2 fabulous sort of microscope images of the left one is a moth and the right one is a butterfly. But you can see how these scales give rise to the fantastic diversity of patterns and coloration that we see in butterflies and moths. So that's butterflies and moths together. Now, determining what exactly a butterfly is from a moth is actually a bit more difficult. And this is a box of a cabinet of specimens that the Natural History Museum in London like to get out on public engagement events, and they like to ask people to have a look through these and tell them which are moths and which are butterflies. So I'll just give you a few seconds, really, just have a look at these. Some of them are obviously tropical and rather exotic, but others are British. We occasionally get this one, which is the Death's Head hawk moth, and fans of horror films might recognize it from Silence of the Lambs, because it features in that. And then even these are British species. This is Jersey tiger moth, and we have a garden tiger moth there. All right, so it's a bit of a trick, this, because they are all, in fact, moths. Every single specimen in this cabinet is a moth. And I think the point that the Natural History Museum are trying to make with this cabinet are even things like this here, which hopefully you can see with my pointer, is a Madagascan sunset moth. Really, you wouldn't think that's a moth, and you know, it's I think it flies by day, obviously on Madagascar, and really is very much butterfly-like. So it's not straightforward. There are no easy ways to tell them apart, and the only way to tell moths and butterflies apart actually really is to know what family they are in. So this is just an evolutionary tree of Lepidoptera. So that's related to the outgroup, which are Trichoptera caddisflies, which means hairy winged, because they have hairs all over their wings. But you can see here that the butterflies in blue are a group within moths, within Lepidoptera, essentially. Don't worry about the greens and the oranges. I'll come back to that distinction later. That's a further distinction that we have in Lepidoptera. But essentially, the way to tell what's a moth and what's a butterfly is to know what family it's in. And the Victorians and the Georgians sort of had favourite families, and there were sort of 4 or 5 families that they were particularly fond of, which they called butterflies, and they thought were distinct enough to merit their own name, and everything else got called a moth. But it is, yeah, it's completely arbitrary, really, and there's no real distinction between butterflies and moths. I just put this slide in just briefly, just to sort of show you a bit about the evolution of moths. I won't talk about it for long, but I think it's fascinating because this is right back here, 250 million years ago is when we think that Lepidoptera first emerged, the very first moths. So that was before the first dinosaurs and before the first mammals, before flowering plants. And really, if you look at that time scale, you've got humans emerging right at the very last moment. Moths have been around for an incredibly long time. Okay, so I'll talk a bit now about moth life cycles and some more unusual life histories that they have, and a bit about their importance in terrestrial ecosystems. So this is your classic life cycle of a moth. I don't like to take too many things for granted with talks like this. I was giving it was a public moth event actually up in North Wales, and it was engineering, PhD engineering students, and it just hadn't occurred to one of them that caterpillars and moths or butterflies were the same organism. Somehow they'd managed to get to where they were without knowing that distinction. So yeah, this is the life cycle of a butterfly and indeed a moth. For anyone who's not familiar, you have the adult stage, which is responsible for dispersal and for reproduction. The females lay eggs, which hatch into caterpillars. And the caterpillars are essentially just an eating machine. That's their only purpose, is to get fat very quickly and then pupate, where they undergo this complete metamorphosis into the adult again. So yeah, I'll start off just by talking about the caterpillars and then the adults, because these are basically the 2 most important stages and have the most interesting sort of life histories. So caterpillars live much longer than adults and are probably a much more important stage to focus on, even though we usually focus on the adults. But adult moths might only live for as little as 1 or 2 days, although most species probably live for a week or two, but really they don't live for very long. Whereas caterpillars, of course, might be around for many, many weeks, maybe even a couple of months. And in a few cases, the caterpillar stage will overwinter many, many years, so will actually be alive for maybe 3 or 4 years. And these caterpillars have evolved many strategies for avoiding predation. As you can imagine, there are many predators of caterpillars. Birds are probably the most important one. And you have, for instance, some of the earliest moths were leaf miners. So the caterpillar spends its whole existence living within a leaf, burrowing through the leaf. And obviously that affords it some level of protection. Most caterpillars are nocturnal and will spend the day completely still, perhaps mimicking a twig like this, fantastic geometrid caterpillar. And then come night, they'll obviously wander around and start feeding when there are no birds around. Some caterpillars don't worry too much about camouflage because they are showing warning coloration. This is aposematic coloration, and this is a magpie moth, which is a fairly common garden moth here in the UK, but it actually contains small amounts of cyanide. So if a bird is unlucky enough to sort of peck at it, it will taste horrible. It won't harm the bird, I don't think, but the bird will very quickly learn never to touch a caterpillar that looks like that again. And now most caterpillars, they feed on plants. There's so probably something like 90–95%, I would say, of British moths feed on plant material of some sort, and often they're very specialised. It's usually the leaves they're feeding on, and you often get this case where it's a single species of moth is feeding on a single species of plant, which is one of the reasons why there are so many species of moth, which I'll come on to a little bit later. So moth caterpillars do have some unusual life histories, and I'll go through a few examples now. And this just goes to show that not all moth caterpillars do eat plant material. So these 2 examples on the left are from Hawaii. And something a bit strange has gone on with the sort of evolution of moths in Hawaii, because these are Euphysicea moths, so they're pug moths. Anyone is mothers and familiar with the pugs. In the UK, they all feed on flowers and leaves. But on Hawaii, these are almost all carnivorous, and they catch flies. They sort of sit still, waiting presumably what's quite a long time for a fly to land nearby, and then immediately snap their body back and catch the fly. Similarly, this is also from Hawaii. As the scientific name suggests, Molluscivora, it feeds on snails. So this is the caterpillar's head, and this is its case that it's made. And what it's done is it's made a web of silk to ensnare this snail, which it then goes on to consume. These are quite sort of exotic examples, but we even have some carnivory in UK moths. So the dunbar is a really common macromoth in the UK, and typically it will feed on leaves. I guess it's more of an omnivore, but if it does happen to come across a nice juicy caterpillar, probably of another species, then it will eat it. And this is probably because a caterpillar with the various proteins and partially digested plant material that it contains is a much more nutritious meal than just chewing on fresh leaves. Mark mentioned this in the intro, and this is another unusual place that you find moths in bird nests, and this is something I did for my undergraduate project, Yeah, and I collected rather a lot. I collected about 200 bird nests, which contained 4,500 individual moths, huge numbers. And basically these moths are detritivores, so they're feeding, some of them will be feeding on things like the dried moss that builds up in bird nests, but some will be feeding on the animal detritus that builds up, like feathers, maybe even little bits of food left over. And it's interesting because it's this sort of niche, the bird nests, that we think the very first clothes moths actually came from, because bird feathers, for instance, are made of keratin, and keratin is the same substance that your fingernails are made from, that hair is made from, that wool is made from. So we think that it's probably this, these groups that were feeding on bird feathers in bird nests that took to feeding on our jumpers. And I should say at this point we have about 2,500 species of moth in the UK, and only 2 or 3 of those are known to cause any sort of damage to clothes, and they're probably both the main ones are probably non-native. We think they originated in Africa, and when we were sort of trading, exotic tapestries and whatnot around the world, or rugs and animal hides, we probably introduced these moths to the UK. Another really cool life history, and this is another British example, is of the China marks. And this small subfamily of moths, the adults, you'll find them flying low over ponds. And that's because the larvae are entirely aquatic. So the adults will lay their eggs on the pond surface. But this is what the larvae look like. And these fantastic structures that you can see coming out are essentially the gills, which allow these caterpillars to live underwater and munch away on pond weeds. And then finally, just in this series of somewhat unusual life histories, is the wax moth. Now, this is a species that is usually found in bee nests or beehives, where it would feed on beeswax and sort of the honeycomb, those sorts of very hard to digest structures. And recently it's been discovered that this particular species can actually eat plastic. So there's quite a lot of active research into whether this moth, and probably the bacteria and microbes that it had in its gut that allow it to break down plastics, could be contribute a solution to the big plastic problem that we have at the moment. Right, so they were sort of caterpillar life stages. So I'll move on to the adult now, which is perhaps the most familiar, certainly if anyone has done light trapping before. So just as with larvae, one of the biggest evolutionary pressures for an adult moth is to avoid being eaten. So you have, this is one of my favourite moths actually, the buff-tip, and very clearly it's mimicking a broken birch twig, and it'll sit there, just fantastic camouflage. The middle image is of the Chinese character. Now, this is a surprisingly common anti-predation defense. It's not really camouflage, because what this moth and about 200 other species in the UK are doing is they are mimicking bird poo. And rather than hiding away under vegetation, as many moths do, these bird poo mimics will just sit on the surface of a leaf during the day, quite content in the knowledge that no bird is going to take a peck at them. And in this right example, red underwing, when this moth is at rest, its forewings would cover its hind wings, so you wouldn't see any of that red. It would just be that brown mottled coloration, and if that tree wasn't covered in moss, you can imagine it being very well camouflaged. Now, if a bird does spot the moth, maybe it's rested on the wrong tree, for instance, the bird will give it a peck, and the moth will flash those really bright hind wings, and that is called startle coloration. And the thought is that it just startles the bird and just gives the moth a few seconds to escape and to fly off. So when a moth emerges from its pupa, when a female moth emerges from its pupa, almost immediately she will start emitting sex pheromones, and these attract males. So this is one of our only, or I think it's our only native silk moth that we have in the UK, the emperor moth, certainly common in North Wales, moorlands, heathlands. It's perhaps most often found. But this is a male, and it's got these huge feathery antennae, as you can see, coming out of its head. And these are feathery like this, basically to give it a big surface area, because there are many thousands of species of insect releasing their pheromones into the air, and they obviously make up they're just tiny molecules, so they're a very small concentration, so it just needs to be able to pick up those specific pheromones. And what this particular species has been shown to do is been able to reach a female about 8 miles away, so it can follow that plume of pheromones that the sort of wind has taken and carried those pheromone molecules off, and he will follow them back to mate with her. Many adult moths feed, but not all of them do. So there are lots of moths. I think the emperor moth is an example of this, actually, that do not feed. So once its energy reserves run out, it's just reliant on the reserves that it built up as a caterpillar, and once they've run out, that's the end, really. But other moths do sustain themselves as adults, like this hummingbird hawk moth, which is well, typically not a resident in the UK. Usually it's sort of as a migrant species, but with climate change, it used to not be able to survive our cold winters. But our winters aren't really so cold anymore, certainly not in the south, so it seems to have it's become established in the south of England. But if anyone's ever seen them, they do a remarkable impression of a small hummingbird hovering around flowers by day. And then another little cool story with moths is their interaction with bats. So bats are a major predator of moths, one of the few nocturnal predators that moths have to contend with. And there's been, this really interesting evolutionary arms race. So bats obviously hunt using echolocation. So they emit ultrasonic clicks, which allow them to detect how close an object is by how long it takes for that click to bounce back off the object and be detected again. But some moths have evolved these sort of primitive ear-like organs along their body, which allow them to hear these ultrasonic clicks and listen in to the bat. And when they sense a bat is close, they will drop out of the sky or sort of do either loop-the-loop or some sort of evasive maneuver to escape the bat. And some moths, some tiger moths, have gone one step further because they can actually produce their own ultrasonic clicks. And what this means is that the bat, it just completely confuses the bat. It jams its echolocation because it's just getting all these new clicks sent at it, so it just can't work out where the moth is. So yeah, moths have huge ecological importance. They're pretty much central to the functioning of every terrestrial ecosystem globally. They're food for all sorts of other organisms, like the bat example that I just talked about, but also birds. So, for instance, it's been estimated that blue-tit chicks in the UK eat 35 billion moth caterpillars each year, and if it weren't for those moth caterpillars, the chicks would starve because they eat almost nothing else. And another important role that moths play is as pollinators. And it's really only in the last sort of 5-10 years that the role of moths as pollinators has really been recognized. Pollinator ecologists have typically been diurnal and have sort of focused all their study during the day, but it's only been more recently when people have started going out at night and studying nocturnal pollinators, and moths are turning out to be really, really important. And often they form sort of generalist associations, but sometimes they can form really specialist ones. So this example on the right here is from Madagascar. And Darwin and I think Wallace too visited Madagascar, or maybe they were sent specimens of this orchid, and it's a big orchid, and it's got a really long tube down to the nectaries. And they hypothesized that it must be some species of moth with a really long proboscis, a really long tongue, that pollinates this orchid, and it's a very specialist association. It's that one moth, that one orchid, and should one of those two species go extinct, then so does the other. And I think about 150 years later, after they predicted that, someone finally found the moth, and they were, of course, completely right. A moth with a ridiculously long, a hawk moth with a ridiculously long proboscis was found to be the sole pollinator for this plant. Right, okay, so I'll move on now to tell you a little bit about British moths and stats, and also how they're doing in terms of their sort of conservation and sort of trends in their abundance. So this is the sort of areas are proportional to the numbers. We have about just under 2,500 species of moth in the UK, and you compare that to butterflies, and we only have about 60 species, so really dwarf in comparison to the number of moths. But interestingly, we have probably about 3 times the number of day-flying moths as we do the number of butterflies, and people often forget this, that there are many moths that are diurnal and do fly during the day. So there's this other distinction in Lepidoptera, which I touched on earlier, and that's that of macromoths and micromoths. So we have about 900 species of macros in the UK, and these moths are typically bigger. And then we have just over 1,500 species of micromoth, which, as the name suggests, they're typically smaller. But if I go back to this phylogeny that I showed you earlier, the greens, the families in green refer to macromoths, and those in the sort of orange are micromoths. And again, you can see how this distinction really isn't, it doesn't have any basis in evolutionary history. It's very much arbitrary. Once again, it was sort of the early Georgians and Victorian entomologists who favoured butterflies and also macromoths, but largely ignored micromoths. So it was the macromoths that they collected in large numbers, and it was the macromoths that they gave interesting names. But if we just sort of explore this diversity a little bit, so on the macromoth side, this is a nice example of a day-flying moth. This is a 6-spot burnet, a Zygaenidae here. This is a scorched carpet, which is a geometrid down here, and then probably the largest end of the size spectrum for macromoths is this Convolvulus hawk moth, which is a Sphingidae. Whereas on the micromoth side, this is a Micropteryx, and these are some of the most evolutionary primitive moths. They're about the size of a grain of rice, but you do get some moths that are even smaller. Some of those leaf mining moths, the adults are only about 2 or 3 millimeters in length, so absolutely tiny. Then terreforage plume moths, like this lovely white plume moth, very closely related to butterflies, interestingly. And then at the sort of the larger end of the size spectrum for micromoths is a pyralids, which are here. And these are typically maybe an inch, inch and a half maximum in wingspan. But confusingly, you do get some species of micromoths which are bigger than some species of macromoths, and vice versa. So knowing the difference isn't always straightforward, and again, it's knowing what family they are in. But this sort of divide has been really important until recently. There weren't any good books on micromoths. I think it was 2012 that Richard Lewington and Phil Sterling's book was published. But yeah, there's sort of always been a historic focus on the macromoths, and one of the ways that you can this sort of manifest is in their common names. So micromoths generally don't have common names, whereas macromoths do, and they've got this really rich history and a fascinating history, I think. And it's, again, Mark touched on this at the beginning. I've written articles about this in the past, because sort of the names really hark back to a long gone era. So you've got things like ermine moths, and you can just see how the pattern and the general furriness is clearly a reference to ermine fur. Pug moths, apparently the breed of dog became popular in the 1800s, first became popular then, and these group of moths is rather uninteresting group of moths typically, are so named apparently because the larger forewing overhangs the smaller hindwing, just like the larger upper lip of a pug overhangs the smaller lower lip. And then perhaps a slightly more obvious example, this is a shuttle-shaped dart, and it's so named for this marking on in the centre of the forewing, which closely resembles a loom shuttle. So yeah, a really nice history of common names for macromoths. And another sort of important distinction, or sort of a consequence of that early distinction between macromoths and micromoths, is that macromoths have been much better studied. So we have trend data for macromoths only, and we don't really know necessarily how micromoths are doing as a whole. But for the just under 900 species of macromoths, about a third of them, the commonest third, we have trends for their abundance. And this is derived from the Ross Hampstead Insect Survey. So this is a network of traps that have, right back since when they made the first trap, I think in the 30s, the design has never changed. They've never changed the bulb, they've never changed the moth trap design or the operating protocol, so that it offers really nice standardized data from which you can determine changes in abundance. And sadly, more species are declining than are increasing. Occupancy trends. So occupancy is just basically a measure of range. These are available for about 2/3 of macromoths, many more species, and this derived from the National Moth Recording Scheme. So if you've ever submitted moth records to Butterfly Conservation, to your county moth recorder, it's this data set that has been used to calculate these trends. And again, you can see a broadly similar pattern with some species declining, some species with sort of stable trends, and other species increasing. This is the overall picture for the total number of macromoths caught by that standardized network of traps, the Ross Hampstead network that I was just talking about. So don't worry too much about the y-axis, it's just an index to the first year. What's really significant here is the percentage, and that just corresponds to the change in the total number of macromoths that have been caught. And there you can see a 36% fall since the late 60s to up to I think 2018 is where that graph goes up to. And interestingly, it's not uniform across Britain. So a coarse division, if you just divide Britain into a southern and a northern half, most of that overall trend is coming from the south of Britain, whereas in the north of Britain, at least until recently, trends have been pretty stable. But interestingly, one all that trend data were from the late 60s, but there's one Rothamsted trap, one of these really nicely standardized traps that's been run much earlier, right back in the 30s. And you can see how actually there's a huge drop then, and this is the window that really we have the most data for. So I think it's a really nice case of shifting baseline syndrome. We sort of take the late 60s as our starting point, because that's when we had nationwide monitoring of moths, but actually what happened before then looks like could have been really our sort of insect Armageddon like scenario. And the sort of scientists at Rothamsted have suggested, we've only got a sample size of one unfortunately, but have suggested that this probably happened across much of Britain sort of after the war in the 50s. There was the mechanization of agriculture, the introduction of pesticides and fertilizers, for instance, really changing the face of the British countryside, and it's probably that that's led to this huge drop. As I say, it's only one site, so we're limited by what we can say, really. But yeah, there is evidence that habitat loss, particularly due to agriculture, is or has been a major driver of declines. Perhaps not so much recently, because hedgerows are largely protected by and large in the UK now, but there are probably still certain factors that are intensifying. New classes of pesticides, for instance, or continued nitrogen deposition in the landscape could be driving further declines. Climate change, I think, is arguably one of the most important threats that our moths face. So a nice example of this is the garden tiger. It used to be common in gardens right across the UK, and sadly it's undergone a 92% decline in its abundance over about a 40-year period. It's still reasonably common in North Wales, actually, but sort of more coastal areas and still not in the numbers that it used to be, and it's pretty much gone extinct from most of southern England. And we think the reason why this has happened is the species essentially does not like warm, wet winters. Perhaps it's pupae go mouldy or something like that. And of course, with climate change, we're getting more and more warm, wet winters. And this paper here, which was featured quite prominently in the State of Nature report last year, I think it was, yeah, it would have been last year, that attributed about 50% of negative population trends in British moths to climate change. So really, I think climate change could be a really big threat, and it is a really big threat, and probably that's only going to intensify. Light pollution is another concern, perhaps, for British moths. This is what I'm working on at the moment. That's what I'm doing my PhD on. And you can see this image from the International Space Station. Quite extensive light pollution in the UK. One of the other problems we have in this field is that the sort of sodium lighting, which is characterized by the very yellow or orangey hues, are typically now being replaced by LEDs, and these are typically white, and because they're more energy efficient, rather than councils saving money, they've just opted to make the lights brighter, so you have even brighter lights that are emitting light across a much broader spectrum of wavelengths. And although we don't fully understand the consequences of these changes, there's a fair bit of research that suggests that these LEDs are actually much more harmful in terms of their effects on ecosystems and on wildlife than the previous sodium lighting. Whether light pollution is a major threat to moths is still to be determined. It's something I'm actively working on. I hope to find out and sort of get a little bit closer to over the next few years. My personal view at the moment would be, my judgment would be that it's probably important, but probably not the largest threat they face. And I want to just go briefly back to this, because I've been talking about declines, which are all rather depressing. So I thought I'd just very quickly talk about some of these increases in in abundance and in occupancy. About a quarter of macro moths seem to be becoming more common. And why that is, well, we understand some of these trends well. So one of these is related to cleaner air, particularly the fall in sulfur dioxide, which is produced when coal is burnt. And this is a fairly nasty chemical in the atmosphere, which inhibits the growth of fantastic beard lichens like this one in this photo. And these lichens are food for the caterpillars of a number of species of moths, like the footman moths. So as the air has become cleaner over the last 40, 50 years, well, longer, but this is the period we have the data from since the 70s, there's been more lichens and therefore more of these moths. Another change that we've seen is changes in woodland, but particularly in coniferous woodlands. So since the Second World War, really, the government decided that Britain needs its own domestic supply of timber. The Forestry Commission was established, and initially their policy was quite an aggressive afforestation, often in upland areas, often with non-native species of conifer. And these are not particularly well-liked habitats among ecologists or conservationists, but for a smallish number of species, but maybe slightly larger than you might imagine, actually. But for some species, these can represent suitable breeding habitats, and those species that can breed in these habitats have become more common, we think, as a direct consequence of our forestry policy. And then in sort of suburban areas, things like ornamental cypresses like Leylandii hedges have become very popular because of their sort of ability to screen out the neighbours, and that has in turn led to the moths that can feed on those hedges to become more common, like the Blair's shoulder knot in that image there. But these sort of two nice neat stories, the one of lichen feeders and conifer feeders, only go some way to explain the positive trends shown by British moths. So this is some work I did for my master's project, where I was looking at, I think it was 54 species of macro moth that have become more common. And really only a handful of those species were sort of corresponding to those explanations I've just given. And the reasons for the positive trends in the other species remain largely unknown. We think that climate change is probably important in many cases. So I was just talking about the sort of how much of a threat climate change is, and it's probably going to be one of these things that will very much generate winners and losers. Some species will be able to become more common and will prefer the warmer temperatures, but other species will not. So yeah, very much a case of generating winners and losers. Right, I'm going to move on now to gardens and maybe mothing in gardens. So you can find moth pretty much anywhere in the UK, tops of mountains, right down through to salt marshes and anything in between. But generally, the more native trees you have around, the better. But even a sort of what's not seen as a particularly, special habitat, your humble garden, even an average suburban garden like this, particularly the sort of further south, can easily support many hundreds of species of moth. This right image is actually of my own garden, or my parents' garden, I should say, where I grew up, on the border between Welshpool and Shrewsbury in northern Powys. And I've actually recorded 800 species of moth from my garden. As you can see, it's a fairly wild garden, but it just goes to show how many moths you can get on your doorstep if you look hard enough. But even if you don't have a sort of a fantastic garden, or any sort of trees around at all, this is a chap called Dave Grundy who lives in Birmingham. His garden is about 200 meters from the nearest tree. yet he still recorded several hundred species of moth. So yeah, it just goes to show whatever garden you've got, you'll still have plenty of moths in it. So how might you go about finding moths? Well, perhaps most obviously is light. And this is a question I'm asked very frequently, so I'll preempt it a bit. Yeah, the question is, well, why are moths attracted to light? And it has a very unsatisfactory answer, I'm afraid. And the answer is, we just don't know. There are a huge number of theories out there as to why moths might be attracted to light. I'm not really convinced by any of them fully. None of them really explain the behavior satisfactorily. My preferred theory would be that moths are simply dazzled. Moths have sort of evolved for, what was it, 250 million years on this planet with dark nights, essentially, with no bright bulbs on the ground, and they've just not come across that in their evolution, so it just dazzles them, and then they sort of fly towards it in a dazzled state. That's my favoured explanation, but really we don't know. One thing we do know is that the spectral composition of lamps are important. So lamps that contain more of the bluer wavelengths of light, particularly ultraviolet light, are the most effective at sort of attracting moths. But even ordinary sort of household bulbs, like your porch lamps or your living room lights, you can leave them on a mild night, and you'll probably attract many moths. So in terms of actual light traps, there are many different designs. This is the arsenal of moth trap I use when I go out to go moth trapping and in various places. They're all sort of built on the same principle, which is a lobster pot. Moths will sort of fly towards the light, fall down into the trap, and then they'll find it a bit more difficult to get out. So the trap will retain them. I'm lazy, so I bought these, but certainly it's very easy to make even these sort of Robinson's traps and the Skinner traps. There are lots of DIY. There's lots of guides online to do that yourself if you are of a DIY persuasion, and obviously then it's quite a lot cheaper. But the great thing about moth trapping is that you leave the bright light on all night. The moths will come in, and typically they'll just settle. They'll just you fill it with egg boxes to give them lots of space to settle down, but they'll often just sit still and settle down until the morning. And that's maybe because the bright light has sort of triggered a sort of a daytime response. So maybe they think that it's daytime, and that they ought to be still, for fear of attracting a bird or something. But it just means that you can leave out that trap, and then come morning, you never know what you're going to get when you turn over those egg trays. You don't necessarily need a light trap though, so you can search for flowers at night. If you're ever wandering around in the day and you spot a bush or a flower that's covered in butterflies, return to it at night with a torch, and the chances are there'll be moths nectaring on it too. For example, ragwort is another good plant for moths and indeed butterflies. Some people make their own nectar, and this technique is called sugaring. This can be effective. I found it a bit hit and miss, but it can be effective generally in the autumn when the sort of natural nectar sources are dwindling. It's quite a fun activity to do. You sort of mix up beer and molasses and sugar and all sorts of things, and sort of boil that all up into a sort of treacle-like consistency, and then paint it over tree trunks. But yeah, I won't talk too much more about this, but if you are interested, Butterfly Conservation's website has loads of useful information. They've got a fantastic moth recorder's handbook, so if you just stick Butterfly Conservation moth recorder's handbook into Google, it will come up. And yeah, as I say, that's got lots of great information if anyone has not done moth trapping before but wants to perhaps explore that possibility. I'm told that lots of the suppliers of moth traps are sold out at the moment because of lockdown. Moth trapping has become garden moth trapping, I should say, has become a hugely popular activity, and I think stocks of moth traps are fairly low, but I think there are still some somewhere. So in terms of when you might want to go out mothing, when you might want to put out your moth trap, weather is extremely important. Weather is probably far more important than habitat. You can probably trap many more moths in bad habitat on a good night than you will if you go to the best habitat on a cold, windy night. So yeah, warm nights are the best, and still also, so if there's a wind, moths will often get blown past the trap, so you can sort of mitigate against that by placing the trap in a sheltered position. Generally avoid clear nights around the full moon. Moth traps become a bit less effective when there's a full moon. Moths don't mind the rain at all. Moths, if anything, moth sort of counts can be higher on slightly rainy nights, but it's often the case that maybe your moth traps or you yourself as a moth trapper don't like your things getting wet. So people do often avoid trapping on wet nights for that reason. This is your mothing season in the UK. This is just taken from Garden Moth Scheme data, which is a nice sort of citizen science project. And you can see it's fairly quiet in the winter, although you do have a small number of species which are specially adapted to flying in the winter. And then you get a bit of a peak in sort of March, April with some spring moths. That then dies down a little bit, but then through June and sort of where we are right now, we're sort of just coming up to peak moth season, which is sort of July and August, before it then begins to trail off fairly rapidly, I guess, through September and October as the nights generally get colder. So then, just to finish, I'll briefly tell you a little bit about how you might go about identifying moths. So this is my, or part of my moth library at home. It can be, quite complicated, quite expensive, moth identification. But if you're a beginner, these are the publications that I would recommend starting out with and going from there. So there's Waring and Townsend, which is macro moths, the larger moths. Here, and then there's Sterling and Parsons, which is a guide in very much the same format for micro moths, and these two are both illustrated by Richard Lewington. So these feature illustrations, and then there's a photographic guide by Chris Manley, which features both macro and micro moths, which is also excellent. And some people have a preference. Some people prefer identifying moths from photos. Some people prefer identifying them from illustrations. It's just a matter of preference. But moths are a large and varied group. There's no keys, unfortunately, so ID really isn't necessarily straightforward. It's really a case of learning what the moths look like and then learning their names, and it really is a case of practice makes perfect. But beginners are often surprised at how quickly they learn and pick up names and the species. It's very much a case of spot the difference, unfortunately. So you're comparing. So these are the illustrations, and these are, I find, particularly nice because they're all life-sized in the book, so you can very easily compare your moth to the illustrations and compare the sort of things like the size, the wing shape, and the wing markings are the most informative in terms of getting an ID. One thing I would say is do pay some attention to contextual information. So things like distribution, the flight time, the habitat, because it can be really informative. So for instance, these two species on the left now, look superficially quite similar, and you might worry about which one you've got. This is a bordered beauty, and the one on the bottom is a dark bordered beauty. But if you catch a moth anywhere, sort of in North Wales, for instance, or anywhere else in most of England, it's going to be a bordered beauty, because this dark bordered beauty is an extremely scarce moth, restricted to a sort of a handful of sites on the English-Scottish border and in Scotland. So it's not one really you have to worry about at all for much of the UK. Similarly, these are two species of pug, and they look very similar actually. But the top image is of a brindled pug, which fly very early in the year. The first pug on the wing from sort of March and April really, whereas this bottom image is of a juniper pug, which is an autumn flying species. So just by knowing that, you can sort of very quickly rule out one or the other. There's some information not to take too much notice of, and that's the common names. So the common names were formed back in the Georgian times mostly. So things like the scarce footman, which is one of these footman moths which feed on lichens. It's become far more common and is in no way scarce. So yeah, don't take any notice of that. And conversely, the common fanfoot evidently must have been a common moth previously, but now it's restricted to, I think it's a red data book species, or perhaps it's nationally scarce, but it's very rare and restricted to a handful of ancient woodlands in southern England. So yeah, very much not common at all. Another thing to be wary of are worn moths. This is the same species, Apamea monoglypha, dark archers. So sort of A is your very fresh individual, and then B, you can see the markings are slightly dulling, perhaps patches taken out of the wing. Even more so on C, and you can see you've got this sort of bold patch beginning to appear, and that's because the scales on its head, on its thorax, are wearing off, and what that red mark is the exoskeleton. And then obviously that last image, if you're not familiar with the species, you're probably not going to be able to identify it. So yeah, it's just something to be aware of. Moths don't always look like how they appear in the books, because they get worn. And some moths are incredibly variable, some aren't. Some are remarkably static in their markings and their size, but some moths are very variable. So this is Mesopomea sacchalis, the common rustic, and all of these are various forms of the common rustic. So yeah, hugely variable, as you can see. But it was a cryptic species in that there's another species, Mesopomea didyma, which was only described relatively recently. It had been previously overlooked as sacchalis, and this is the lesser common rustic. But really, to separate these two, you have to dissect them and look at the structure of their genitalia. It's the only sure way to tell them apart. So that's fairly rare with macromoths. It's a bit more common with micromoths. There's probably maybe 10 or so pairs of or small groups of macromoths which really need that extra level of care, but most of them with a bit of care can be identified from photos, for instance. There are some new or fairly new technology sort of solutions that can make moth identification much easier. This is an app, a free app made by colleagues at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And it's very clever. You can get it on your phone, you can just get it on your computer. If you just search what's flying tonight, moths maybe, and it will come up. But what it does is it knows your grid square, it knows where you are, and it obviously knows the date. So it will, based on those two pieces of information, it will display the most likely species based on data from the National Moth Recording Scheme. So the number of records that have been of these species that have been seen at that date, at that location on that date. So yeah, that can really help narrow things down. If you're starting from 900 species, narrow it down to the very most likely. One step further are AI recognition apps, and these are becoming increasingly more popular and increasingly better, actually. So there's 3 that I've tried. Google Lens, which isn't great. I suspect that the data sets that it's been trained on are American, because most of the suggestions you get are of American species. iNaturalist is a bit better, but it does make mistakes. And the best one that I've found so far is Obs Identify, which I think is from Holland, from the Netherlands. And the thing I like particularly about this app is that it gives you some uncertainty. So it's not sure, but it thinks this is a white mark, and it's absolutely correct. Up here, it's 100% certain, I think, that this is a red underwing, and it's bang on right. This one, it's not sure about. It thinks it's probably Agonopteryx arenella. It's not. It's actually a form of the very variable Eclairus christiana. So it got that it could be an Eclairus. So yeah, half mark for that. This is a bit less good though, because it's certain that it's Edonia dillionella, but in fact it's Scoparia bastrigalis. So yeah, it's not one to be relied on entirely, but if you're just starting out, it can, I imagine, be an invaluable for just pointing you in the right direction, and yeah, giving you some idea of what genus, for instance, a moth might be in. There are also all sorts of active communities that will be willing to help. So, I mean, for instance, you're welcome to email me or tweet me any photos or questions. If you're on Facebook, there's some great groups. So there's a Recording Moths, which is just sort of a general group. And then there's one just specific for UK micromoth identification. And again, they're both really friendly communities of people who, if you are struggling, will be more than happy to point you in the right direction. And that's just about it from me. So I hope that was interesting. And yeah, I'd be happy to answer and have a go at answering any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you very much, Douglas. That's fantastic. Thank you. I think you've dispelled the myth that moths are either brown or boring, and we've all thought again, I'm sure. If you want to come out of your sharing, we can maybe kind of have a look at thank you. That's great. If anybody wants to, you can now pop your videos on if you wish to, and if you want to ask a question, either use the chat function, that'd be great, or if you put your hand up, either in participants or physically put your hand up and ask a question, that'd be great. Anybody?
John Almond.
Can I just John
Almond.
Do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yeah, simply, is there a local supplier for moth traps?
Local to North Wales?
The nearest I can find is in Gloucestershire.
Yeah, I don't think so. No, there's a few companies. There's Anglian Lepidoptera suppliers, which are obviously East Anglia. There's Watkins Doncaster. I don't know where they're based. And then Natural History Book Society sell moth traps. Paul Batty, I don't know where he's based. But yeah, no, I don't think, as far as I'm aware, there isn't one for particularly local to North Wales.
Thank you.
I think it's a case of, like they say, going online and checking things out, really. But there are a few useful, like Douglas said, I don't know if you go on Facebook at all. There's a Facebook group called Moth Traps UK, which actually kind of talks about moth traps and occasionally moths, I think, as well, but mostly moth traps and how people are using moth traps and how people are making their own, which is quite useful. Also,
may I ask another question?
Of course you can, yes.
I have a homemade moth trap which I use with an ordinary bulb, but there's I can't remember the name. The Akin something bulbs are the best, aren't they?
So your best bulb's probably a mercury vapor bulb, which emits a huge amount of UV light, but there are actinic bulbs as well, which also are pretty good. So yeah, if you're using an ordinary bulb, yeah, that's maybe not emitting much UV light, you might not expect huge catches. But if, yeah, you just sort of, some people will just sell, so if you've got an existing moth trap, you can just buy the electrics and sort of upgrade your bulb, if, as it were. They usually need a specialized choke unit to sort of...
that was what I was going to ask. That was what I was going to ask. They do need a choke and everything.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question?
James, you're on mute yourself. There you go.
Hi, Douglas.
Hey.
Fantastic talk. Thank you very much. When you were showing your library of books, is there one of those that shows caterpillars?
There is.
Of moths, because we've got books with moths in, but we've been finding loads of caterpillars, and it's really hard to find out what they're going to turn into and how to look after them if we're going to help them pupate.
Yeah. So this was only published this spring. It's by Richard Lewington again, and then Barry Henwood and Phil Sterling, who wrote the microbook. But yeah, it's great. So it's got all the I've got all butterflies and macromoths. And then the text will tell you what they should be feeding on, and where they pupate and that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's a great book. It's about 25, 30 quid, something like that.
That's great. That's great. Thanks very much.
Yeah. I know you've got quite a lot of. You've actually pupated quite a few, haven't you, down there? Yeah. What moths have appeared out of the caterpillars you've reared?
Mainly yellowtails.
Oh, are you asking me?
I'm asking you. I'm asking Ezra. I'm asking.
Yeah, Ezra, you need to say. Okay, he's gone shy. Iris?
Mainly yellowtails.
Okay, yeah, nice one. Nice caterpillar.
God, you have to speak, Kate.
Can I ask a question?
Hello? Where are we?
Peter and Monica, I think.
Okay, Peter and Monica. Yeah, sorry.
It's Kay. I just wanted to ask, should I feel guilty about killing clothes moths?
No, you don't have to. Be sure they are clothes moths, because there's lots of little moths flying around your house that won't be clothes moths. But no, I wouldn't worry too much about it. As I think I said, the two main species aren't even native to the UK. Probably imported from Africa about 200 years ago. So they shouldn't really be here. And they're only here to eat our jumpers. They don't play any wider ecological roles. So
that's good. Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Ben? If I got the title right, I looked on my iPad just now for What's Flying Tonight, and I couldn't find, it didn't have the app. Was that the correct title?
What's Flying Tonight? Yeah, if you took What's Flying Tonight Moths, it should come up. Let me try Googling it. It's by CEH, so if you... What's Flying Tonight?
It's quite. I use that. It's quite useful to just like Douglas said, to bring back the number of bring down to a reasonable level the number of species you're likely to see.
Yeah,
it's not totally accurate, but it kind of. Yeah,
it's not in the App Store, but if you Google it, because it's not an app that you download.
Oh, right.
like a usual app. So you Google it, and then there's a link on the Butterfly Conservation website, for instance, to it.
Right. Thank you.
I remember when I first started moth trapping, 12, 13 years ago, before apps and whatever kind of were there, I used to use something like there was a garden moth scheme, and they used to print off what you're likely to see in each month, and that was kind of I used that kind of diligently to kind of like break it down, really, because like Douglas said, so many moths, and you start looking at the book when you're first starting, it looks a little wow. And there are quite a lot of brown ones still, not all quite so colourful, but it's worth giving it a go. Any more questions from anybody? I'm trawling through here quickly. Sue, is it Sue?
I just wanted to say, I thought I'd have loads of questions, but your talk is so good. It answered so many of the questions I had. So thank you. It was really good.
Just checking other.
Thank you.
Just checking anyone else that might be visible. No, there's nobody else visible. That's fine. I think. Oh, yeah. Go. Will. Was it? Will?
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you for talk. Lovely talk. Enjoyed it. I was just wondering if there's any secret way of keeping cabbage white butterflies away from my brassicas.
A gardener.
You can just squish them, I think. I don't think there's a particularly good way to keep them away. They've got quite a high rate of parasitism. I think it's something like 80% of them will be parasitized, and so if you squish them, you can often find all the wasp larvae that are inside that are eating them alive.
Oh wow!
Quite fun. But yeah, unless you want to, use pesticides, there's not really any secret ways, I don't think, to keep them away, unfortunately.
Okay, I'll get my tennis racket on.
Not that I know of, anyway.
Okay, thank you.
Can I come to you in a minute, Paul? Somebody raised their hand. An iPad? Who's iPad? iPad's raised their hand. Can I ask a question?
Can I ask one, Mark? Peter here.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can now, yes, yeah.
Okay. Sitting with me at the moment is my dog, which is a pug.
Uh-huh.
And I've often wondered who his mother was. You've not got that?
Oh, it's a dad joke. Who his mother is.
Thank you, Paul. You got it. I'll go home now.
Yeah.
Right, Paul, go for it.
I've got a small garden, and just referring back to the cabbage white, also known as large white, I always plant nasturtiums, and they always go for them. Whether it's like like an alternative, they'll go for the nasturtiums instead of the cabbages. I don't know, but worth trying. They're so easy to grow, as Anna Griffiths knows. She's already got lots of large white caterpillars on yours, haven't you?
Nodding the head.
Anybody, any more questions? That's great.
Mark?
Yes, hello? Hello?
It's Chris Cooper. Unfortunately, we joined his iPad. Can you hear me?
Oh, hello. Yes, hi.
Yes.
Yes, yeah, I can hear you. I can't. Are you? Yeah. Go on.
It should be on screen.
Yes,
yeah, it is.
You is indeed, yeah.
Yeah.
If you can hear me, thanks from us for a great talk from Douglas. I'll just chip in. I'd heard the nasturtium suggestion for brassica protection as well, but it's interesting to hear someone who's found it successful. But my question was actually about the frequency of using a garden trap. There must be some disruption that when you trap moths, they're sort of them. So I wondered if there's any guidance on not doing it more than once a week.
Yeah. So I think there are a few things to bear in mind here. I think the first thing is that moth traps are actually really ineffective ways of sampling moths. So if you sort of mark release recapture studies have shown this, that they only catch a really tiny proportion of the moths that are in an area. So that's the first thing it's not like they suck in all the moths from a mile radius or anything like that. It is quite small numbers. But yeah, there are some things that sort of a diligent mother might want to do, and they'd probably be mostly around dealing with the catch after use. Well, actually, there are a few. So first thing would be get up before the birds if you can. Otherwise, the birds will very quickly learn that there's a platter of moths, on a warm summer's night spread out around the moth trap, and they'll all very quickly get hoovered up. But then the next one would be releasing them. So don't just leave your moth trap out and again there'd be birds that would come in and peck them all off. Make sure you're releasing them into long vegetation, and then the next thing would be not running the trap on consecutive nights. But it's however often you want to do it. But I think if you were just to do it every other night, if you wanted to do it that frequently, that would be absolutely fine. In terms of negative effects on moths, it would be negligible.
Is that okay? Yeah. It's, I think the garden moth scheme, which you mentioned during your talk, they encourage people to actually try and trap on.
Thank you for that.
Friday night. Yeah. So, did someone say?
On the topic of avoiding the moths getting caught by anything, I had an amusing incident a couple of weeks ago when I looked out at midnight and the neighbour's cat had discovered the moth trap and was leaping around like a kitten, trying to catch all the moths around the trap.
Yeah, cats
in
can
its
be,
paws, which was a bit annoying.
Yeah.
Iris wants to say something.
Iris. Yep. That's it. Go for it.
How did Douglas get interested in moths?
Good question. So I've always sort of been interested in wildlife generally, but moths specifically. I went on a course with Nick Baker, the sort of TV naturalist. He's not on so much anymore, but he used to do the Really Wild show when I was growing up. And yeah, that was just sort of a general wildlife course, and it involved some moth trapping. And I just thought it was great how you could just stick out a moth trap and the next morning, have potentially hundreds of species. And yeah, I was sort of hooked, and right from that. And I think that was when I was 12.
That's good. Yeah.
Say that you're moth traps.
And you started moth trapping too, haven't you, Iris? Yeah. So, how many species do you think you've had in your moth trap since just I guess
40 or 50?
Yeah, that's
very good.
Yeah. And how long have you been doing it for?
Every week for the last 2 months.
Keep it up. Yeah, you'll only get more and more species now as we get into the summer. So yeah, awesome.
Very good.
The only hawk moth we've had is a privet hawk moth. Poplar hawk moth.
Poplar's the most common, but yeah, you may well catch elephant hawk moths, which are the sort of pink and greenish ones. They're pretty common around now. So keep trying.
That's good. Anybody else? I'm trying to think. Anna, go on, Anna. Have you unmute yourself? There you go.
I was just wondering. I'm just wondering if I'm making this up or if I've heard it correctly. That some moths aren't attracted to light. The ivy feeding moths or something aren't attracted to light. Is that true?
So there are definitely huge variations in how attracted a given species is to light. Some moths are really strongly attracted and others are just, for whatever reason, not. So I don't quite know about the ivy feeders. It might just be that there are some species of moths, that are much more easy to nectar sources like... Oh, good Lord. Nectar sources like ivy or buddleia or whatever. So yeah, I suspect that will be it. The sort of and the sugaring I was saying as well, that can be a technique that can pick up moths that are generally not so attracted to light, but most moths are attracted to light. But yeah, you're right, some aren't, and certainly lots of micro moths. If you get really into micro moths, you need to sort of move away from the light trap and start going out and doing sort of very targeted searches to sort of find them, because they just don't come to moth traps in frequently enough.
Okay, that's good. Just a quick, if anybody else hasn't got a question at the moment, I just wonder about recording. What's your? I mean, I send my records to the local, the county moth recorder.
Yeah.
And that's guess what you'd recommend yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with moth recording, there a few bits of advice if anyone is sort of starting out doing it is not to worry too obsessively about making sure you record every last moth that you catch in your trap. That's not you know, the schemes, the recording schemes are not necessarily set up for that. So, you know, if there's a pug that you're just struggling with, you know, just throw it over your shoulder and pretend you didn't see it. That really doesn't matter. There's no point sort of spending hours as a beginner getting frustrated because you can't identify something, because, you know, the point, you know, it's meant to be fun. So, you know, if you're you know, struggling with IDs, just record the easy things and that's fine. But yeah, as you get better, and you'll quickly pick them up, and there's lots of help around too. But yeah, county moth recorders would be the way to do it. You can submit data to your county moth recorder, who will verify that and collate that. So I'm actually a county butterfly recorder, funnily enough. So yeah, we do this job, we collate all the data, that then gets sent off to Butterfly Conservation every year, and entered into their national schemes, and is used in all sorts of, you know, it's hundreds of scientific papers a year are published using these data sets. So it's, you know, incredibly valuable to do. But at the same time, it's not something you need to worry about doing, you know, stringently too much. It's not got a set methodology. It's just send in what you see. So it's fairly relaxed.
Now you tell me.
Richard's comment.
When we first started, we were sometimes weeks trying to organise, to identify the occasional moth. Anybody else? I know since we've got a Covnod guy here. Go on, Richard.
I don't know if I am representing Covnod at the moment. I think
okay.
my lunch break or something. Yeah, I've only just started moth trapping myself, and I've noticed that the noctuids, generally you can push them into a pot with a finger.
Yeah.
The geometrids tend to flutter off. Are there any tricks to pot these things up? Because I must admit I've lost quite a few of them.
Yeah, so generally, yeah, if you've got like a geometer or something, you'd get your pot, I don't have one to hand, but you sort of put it right over the moth, and then gently sort of move it around a bit if you can, if you've got the space. If it's sort of egg trays, it can be a bit tricky. So if they're on egg trays, you could just tip it over and give it a bit of a tap, and then it can just sort of fall in. Or if you just sort of gently push its head area, it will often just fly up into the pot. And then if you quickly, but yeah, as you say, it can be difficult, and yeah, noctuids are much more amenable just through a bit of a light prod and into the pot, and you don't lose them. But yeah, we've all been there. That there's been, you know, the rarest moth in the trap that you've just seen, and you know, very exciting, and it's the one that gets away. So it's unavoidable, really. But
I must admit, I am hoping for some more hawk moths. I've only had that elephant hawk moth, like you said before, so yeah, I'm looking forward to something different.
yeah, elephant hawk moth, poplar hawk moth, sort of, yeah, for North Wales, they're the two most common. You'll also get lime hawk moth in more lowland areas, eyed hawk moth if you've got willows around, and small elephant hawk moth is fairly common too. But yeah, keep at it, and yeah, more will appear.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Thanks, Richard. Okay, keep trapping. Okay. If anybody, like I mentioned it earlier on, if anybody wishes to join us on our moth night, the first Monday of the month, 6th of July, just email me, really, and we'll try and sort it out. And it maybe help with some people who I'm looking at now have come along to that moth meeting, and you're welcome to come along and join us at the next one if to find out more. Okay. Any more questions? We're coming up to gone 3:30 now. So if we
some lovely comments, Mark, from people.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of great comments, Douglas. You can probably see them yourself there. Thank you very much. What's this one with?
Oh.
Mothing is an obsessive passion, I think.
Yeah, indeed.
From Debbie, last comment there. I think that is so true. I think once you start doing it, it's hard to stop, I think. And once you keep on going, and it's hard to take a break from it in some respects. And that maybe once a week is probably sufficient. I've been doing it once a week for quite a long time. Even during the winter, people are quite, you can get a moth in the middle of winter and a frosty snowy day, can't you, Douglas? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Douglas. It's been fantastic. I think,
Thank you.
And if people haven't unmuted already, anybody have any more questions? Last chance coming up there, folks. Do you want to unmute and maybe give Douglas a round of applause? It's much appreciated. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Maybe see somebody next week at Butterflies. I'll get in touch with people if they get in touch with me. Yeah. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us
Thanks
yet
everybody
again.
for
That's
going.
lovely. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Douglas. I'll be in touch.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. Bye. I'm going to end it now, folks. Definitely going to end it. Go, go, go. Last chance.